So I have a big pile of entry-level laptops, and after tossing up what to do with them for a while, I decided to subject each of them to its own full-length nuclear review. That means leaving no stone unturned and assessing them all equally regardless of price or configuration, so this will be interesting. We're starting out on a bit of a high note, and things are going to get far worse, but for now, this is the $697 Asus Vivobook Go 15. That Go suffix indicates that this laptop is effectively a stripped-down, cheaper variant of Asus's plastic fantastic mid-range-ish lineup, although in this case, it's been blessed with a gorgeous Samsung AMOLED display. This model also includes what's allegedly a Core i3 CPU, 8GB of RAM, and half a terabyte of SSD storage. Anyway, more on all that later. Design-wise, you're looking at a pretty generic rectangular plastic slab finished here in so-called mixed black, which seems to be a novel way to admit that your plastics don't quite match each other. Interrupting the generally tidy and uncluttered look is this stupid badge on the lid. Thank you, Asus. I have always wanted to go further and explore things with you. There's a few other questionable design choices on this one. Most of the ports are on the right-hand side, so if they're occupied, they're going to get in the way of a mouse if you're right-handed. The hinge lets the lid scrape on the desk if you open it too far. Seriously? And downward-firing speakers are just stupid and really need to go somewhere else. Checking for any lap-murdering protrusions while we're down here, it's mostly clear apart from one small dagger right in the middle. Unfortunately, this little guy doesn't quite touch the desk on its own, so you might hear a little tap coming from this area every now and then while typing or prodding at the trackpad. Dimensions are very compact all round, to the point where the tall rubber feet actually account for a large percentage of the total thickness. It's also nice and lightweight for a 15-inch laptop, but of course the low weight is more a direct byproduct of thin and low-cost materials than anything else. Included in the fully recyclable box and packaging is the usual laptop 65-watt power brick documentation. Nothing exciting here. I'm pleased to report that this unit arrived with absolutely no blemishes or other fit and finish issues, and it doesn't creak when handled or when opening and closing the display. Connectivity isn't too bad, although it could be better. USB 2.0 ports are refusing to die, and the HDMI is version 1.4 from all the way back in 2009. The only replaceable port on this laptop is the single left side USB 2.0 Type A, so if you wear out or break any of the others, too bad. In keeping with the general theme, the typical diving board style clickpad is all plastic, mounted to plastic, and reinforced mostly with plastic. Unsurprisingly, the entire palm rest squishes in every time you click the button. There's also a loud rattle every time you tap to click. Asus's backlit keyboard is a bit of a standout on a laptop in this price range. This almost totally full-sized keyboard has a fantastic feel and surprisingly strong feedback. The layout makes perfect sense to me, and print, screen, insert, and delete all have their own keys. On a less positive note, the white backlighting is PWM dimmed in the low and middle brightness modes, so it flickers noticeably unless it's set to max brightness. The number pad is also slightly undersized, and it would be really nice if the whole laptop wouldn't squish so much while you're typing. Predictably enough, the keyboard is plastic welded onto the top case, so in most cases you're going to be replacing this entire assembly if something goes wrong. The display hinges are tight enough that the display isn't possible to open one-handed, but it does remain locked in place very well once it's open. There is, however, a noticeable amount of wobble, which, when considered against the fairly tight hinges, points to a potential structural issue somewhere. Having a look from inside, you can see there's been some effort put into making the lower hinge brackets as long as possible to spread the load out over a reasonably wide area, so old mate Mr. Wiggle's not hiding in here. Unfortunately, at the other end, inside the lid, things are looking a bit dire, with all the force concentrated over an absolutely tiny area, only a few millimeters tall and 3.5 centimeters wide, bolted straight into soft plastic. Let's attach some numbers to this, shall we? The display lid requires a surprisingly high peak of 750 grams, or 7.35 newtons, of force to lift from fully closed, and 394 grams, or 3.86 newtons, to move in either direction from a 90-degree angle. Calculated over the height of the lid assembly, that means the points where the hinges bolt into the lid, 10 millimeters away from the pivot point, are being yanked on with a shared load of around 17 kilos, or 167 newtons, every time you open the laptop. That's more than 2 kilograms on each of these tiny little screws in their tiny soft plastic houses, every time, and that's assuming you've done it gently. Yep, it's flimsy and it's gonna break. On the plus side, I suppose, the display is mounted to a metal plate which easily unscrews and comes out as a unit instead of being adhered directly to the lid itself, so you could easily swap out a damaged lid with no risk of damage to the display. Speaking of that display, a 1080p AMOLED panel is the polar opposite of what you'd expect in a low-cost computer like this. Brightness is a pretty decent 381 nits, contrast is effectively infinite, and the panel fully covers the sRGB, DCI-P3, and Adobe RGB color gamuts. Color uniformity is basically perfect, and response times are pretty much instantaneous. The only point worthy of criticism is the pentile subpixel layout endemic to Samsung's AMOLED panels causes some chromatic aberration or fringing on text and the edges of some objects. Mounted above the display are a tiny webcam which has been blessed with a privacy shutter and a pair of stereo microphones. The sound system installed in the Vivobook Go is much better than you'd expect, but still nothing mind-blowing. Speaker drivers themselves are round paper units with 1.5cm cones and interesting rubber surrounds, which are a custom design that looks similar to what Asus uses in a few different models like the tough gaming laptops. The enclosures are quite large and shock mounted to prevent vibration. Responsible for driving these is a Realtek ALC3251 integrated audio chip, which is rated for 1.2 watts per channel into 8 ohm speakers at 1% THD. You may recognize that as not enough power, and while the sound quality from this setup is surprisingly good, the lack of volume is very annoying. The Realtek chip also includes a headphone amplifier which outputs a minuscule 20 milliwatts per channel into 16 ohms, so if you have high impedance or even just low sensitivity headphones, you're going to need an external amp. The included storage is a PCIe 4.0 512GB SSD from Solidigm. This unit uses a Silicon Motion SM2269XTF controller which has no DRAM and a single chip of QLC NAND flash. Yep, that's a cheap and nasty SSD. Peak speeds are decent without being particularly impressive, looking more like a PCIe 3 SSD than the on-paper specs might suggest. There's no slot for a second device, and once again there's a thermal pad mounted to the wrong side of the SSD, which does nothing. Despite Microsoft's attempts to get everyone on board with unifying power modes under the Windows Settings app, the My Asus software still contains separate independent power and cooling profiles. That's a little annoying, but most people will probably be fine with picking one and leaving it there since there's really not much difference between all these modes on a machine like this anyway. These settings are not available in the BIOS, which is very disappointing, so you lose this functionality if you uninstall that software or switch to Linux. On that note, the My Asus package is little more than bloatware. Laptops do not need sprawling utility software like this, and it's nothing more than an attempt for the manufacturer to guide you towards extended warranties and paid services. It's worth pointing out that Asus preloads almost nothing else, so other than Microsoft's own loadout of awful crapware and a small installer stub for McAfee personal security, the factory image is nice and clean. Power draw on the Vivobook Go is, as you'd probably expect, extremely low. At idle, in balanced mode while plugged in, as measured from the power outlet, the machine uses around 7.5 watts, and when running flat out with the CPU fully loaded up, this increases to about 40 watts. The 50 watt-hour battery fitted to this unit is reporting about 48.5 watt-hours after calibrating over a few charge cycles. This will gradually drop with use. So what about battery run times? With the display set to 300 nits and sitting on the Windows desktop, the Vivobook managed 23 freaking hours of runtime. Yes, really. I was just as surprised as you are. Doing my usual heavy internet usage test, which is wildly unscientific, it quit after just 8 hours. Much less impressive, but still good. Charging from empty, the battery takes 50 minutes to hit 50%, 1 hour 24 minutes to hit 80%, and is full after 2 hours and 44 minutes. And when it finally wears out, the battery is extremely easy to replace, being held in by 6 screws and no adhesive. Woohoo! Removal takes about 5 minutes, and replacement part number C31N2024 is readily available for around $80. The processor included here is Intel's misleadingly named and comically tiny Core i3 N305. I'm going to pick on the name for a moment because it's bullshit. When I hear Core i3, I expect we're going to be talking about a small but full-featured current generation CPU with something like 2 to 4 of Intel's fast cores. Instead, this so-called Core i3 has precisely 0 of Intel's high-performance P cores, and swaps in 8 Gracemont E cores instead. Yes, that's what used to be called an Atom. Taking the bait and switch a step further, you'd probably also assume a Core i3 is going to support dual-channel RAM just like every Core i3 in recent memory. But you'd be wrong. The N305 only has support for 1 RAM channel, which nukes what little graphics performance there could have been. RAM supplied with this unit is 8GB of Micron DDR4 3200 memory in the form of 4 16GB chips soldered directly to the board. The integrated GPU is a 32 execution unit variant of Intel's Xe graphics, which despite its small size is going to be noticeably starved by that RAM configuration. Being an architecture that predates Intel's newer Arc-I GPUs, the Xe UHD core does not support mesh shading, ray tracing, or AV1, but still supports most modern graphics APIs and Intel QuickSync. The system tasked with extracting heat from the CPU is hilariously small, being a single squashed heat pipe with a tiny little heat spreader attached to the end, gently wheezed over by probably the thinnest fan I've ever seen. There is no contact between the voltage regulators and the heatsink, and the cold plate surface is far from a mirror finish. Without the fan, the cooler weighs an unbelievably light 20 grams. This low weight translates to an extremely low thermal mass, which means almost no ability to absorb transient heat loads without ramping the fan speed, which means every time this computer thinks about something, you're going to hear about it. Low power laptops like this shouldn't be noisy, but here we are. Now the Vivobook Go is probably not intended for heavy workloads or gaming, but that doesn't mean we can't be mean to it. Kicking things off, I've subjected it to a 30-minute stress test running Cinebench R23 on a loop while the laptop sits flat on a desk in its highest performance mode. Since there's no GPU, I haven't run a GPU test at the same time, so 100% of the power budget will be aimed at those processor cores. Package power starts off at a sustained 23-ish watts before dropping to around 18 watts and then resetting itself, ultimately drawing a sawtooth pattern like we last saw on the Dell XPS 15. Core temperatures follow the same pattern, never exceeding around 85 degrees. The result is an unstable core frequency starting at 3 GHz and dropping to about 2.6 over time and then back up in a loop. Despite the lack of any cooling, CPU power delivery components all stay nice and cool under a constant load, with the MOSFETs peaking at only 70 degrees. Meanwhile, exterior surface temperatures are variable, with the palm rest, trackpad and left half of the keyboard staying close to ambient at about 22 to 25 degrees, but the upper right hand side of the keyboard peaks at a very noticeable and uncomfortable 40 degrees. Underneath, temperatures follow the same pattern. A peak of 40 degrees is less problematic down here, but it's still unreasonably high given that this machine is only dealing with about 20 watts worth of heat. Now, this should come as no surprise, but performance is pretty dire on this hardware despite those 8 physical CPU cores. Single-core and multi-core CPU test results in benchmarks like Cinebench R23, which simulates a fairly straightforward rendering load, and Geekbench 6 point to a roughly equivalent performance to a quad-core CPU from 2016. BrowserBench's Speedometer 3.0 tells the same story. This computer is barely a third of the performance of a more typical modern system across the board, and that's noticeable even while browsing the web. The end result is that in normal use, this system just feels straight up laggy. Everything feels like it takes just a bit too long. Poking around on a website like YouTube is a great example of this, with unpredictable little pauses and dropped frames while page elements load in. It's the sort of mild lagginess that you can get used to over time, but it's still there, and it's not great having a computer that's working hard just to do one basic task. Now, cranking things up another notch, gaming performance is probably the most abysmal aspect to any of these entry-level systems, and that's certainly the case here. Gaming benchmarks like 3D Mark's Firestrike and TimeSpy are like watching slideshows, and the resultant scores are roughly on par with bad integrated graphics from last decade. As for whether or not you can get some actual games running here, the answer is sort of no, although that depends on your tolerance for low frame rates. Pretty much nothing I'm currently playing runs acceptably on the N305, no matter how far you turn down the graphics or resolution. Dying Light, for example, is a game that runs beautifully with the details cranked on higher powered integrated graphics, but here it barely manages to hold 30 frames per second and the frame times are a complete horror show. So there you have it. Predictably enough, the Vivobook Go is a complete potato with a fairly fragile and floppy plastic build, a loud fan, and extremely low performance. There's a few plus points here, with the display, keyboard, and battery life being unexpectedly good, but the fact of the matter is that lovely OLED display is wasted on this thing unless all you're doing is passively looking at photos or videos, and an LCD would be more appropriate for basic office work or browsing. Overall, I'm rating this one apathetic laptop out of a possible I don't know how this rating system. Basically, it's close to alright, and I don't hate it, but it doesn't make much sense. Right, 1 down, 5 to go. See you again soon.